Snowmelt crept beneath a service road culvert where a county surveyor paused, sensing order disturbed, a stillness that did not belong. Pine needles framed a shoe, winter dark, unmoving, while breath fogged the air and a clipboard slipped, pages whispering that something here would never be routine again for investigators soon. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. The date was December 14, 1987, and northern Colorado was already deep into the slow, deliberate quiet that settles between Thanksgiving and Christmas. The woman found near that culvert would soon be identified as Emily Rae Hollis, 22 years old, a junior accounting student at Colorado State University, home for the holidays in Larimer County. Her disappearance had been reported 4 days earlier, noted on a missing person flyer taped beside grocery store doors and the post office bulletin board, printed in black ink that bled slightly in winter dampness. The discovery site sat outside Fort Collins, where rural service roads met cottonwood breaks and frozen irrigation channels. It was not wilderness, but it was lonely enough to hide neglect. Emily's last confirmed sighting placed her on December 10, after a late afternoon shift at a retail store in Old Town Square, the seasonal lights already strung across brick facades. Witnesses described her routine without embellishment. She walked to her car, a pale blue sedan parked 2 blocks away, planned to drive home to her parents' house, and return the next morning for a final exam before Christmas break. She never arrived. Her parents waited through the night, then called campus police at dawn. By noon, local law enforcement had taken over, treating the case as a missing adult, but marking the file with a quiet urgency born of winter exposure risks. The scene near the culvert was secured by mid-morning on the 14th. Photographs documented the position of the body relative to the road, the drainage grate, the tire impressions nearby. There was no sign of a struggle in the immediate area. The ground was firm, lightly crusted with ice, preserving impressions without clarity. Emily's identification was confirmed through her wallet and a campus ID, both recovered on her person. The autopsy, conducted at the county medical examiner's office, would later indicate she died from causes consistent with exposure following incapacitation, without graphic detail, and with time of death estimated within hours of her disappearance. There were no defensive injuries. Toxicology screens returned negative for alcohol and common sedatives. The absence of obvious trauma complicated early theories and demanded restraint. Investigators reconstructed Emily's movements through receipts, time cards, and witness statements. Her car was located the next day, December 11, parked at a strip mall several miles from her usual route, windows closed, keys missing. There were no signs of forced entry. Tire tracks near the culvert matched a different vehicle type, not her sedan. Fiber analysis recovered from her coat included synthetic strands common to car upholstery. These were cataloged and stored, their significance unclear in 1987. A partial latent print was lifted from the exterior of her car, smudged and incomplete, insufficient for comparison with the technology of the time. The investigation unfolded amid Christmas preparations. Officers worked past wreaths hung in station corridors, the smell of burnt coffee and pine cleaner mixing as they reviewed maps. Tips arrived unevenly, many well-meaning, few useful. A clerk recalled a man asking for directions near the strip mall. A gas station attendant remembered a vehicle idling too long. None could be corroborated. Media coverage remained measured, reflecting the tone of the local press, emphasizing community concern without speculation. Emily's photograph appeared beside holiday advertisements, a stark juxtaposition. By January 1988, leads thinned. The case was reclassified, not cold in name but in effect. Evidence was boxed, labeled, and placed in climate-controlled storage. The fibers, the partial print, the tire cast, and Emily's clothing were preserved according to policy. Her family marked holidays with absence. Each Thanksgiving carried the weight of an empty chair. Each Christmas Eve repeated the last phone call unanswered. The town remembered, then moved on, as towns do. Years passed. Investigators retired. Roads were widened. The culvert was replaced during a flood mitigation project in the late 1990s. Emily's case was reviewed periodically, often prompted by anniversaries or advances in forensic science. In 2004, the department digitized old files, scanning reports that had yellowed. In 2012, a grant allowed for the re-examination of unsolved cases involving preserved biological material. Emily's file was among those selected. The fibers were reanalyzed, confirming their common origin but offering little specificity. The partial print was rescanned with improved imaging, still insufficient. The turning point came from a trace recovered in 1987 that had been considered too minimal to pursue aggressively. Skin cells collected from the interior handle of Emily's car door. At the time, DNA profiling was in its infancy. The sample had been preserved but not tested. In 2013, analysts generated a partial DNA profile. It did not match any entry in CODIS. The case waited again, until 2019, when investigative genetic genealogy became a lawful tool under strict protocols. With the Hollis family's consent and judicial approval, the partial profile was uploaded to a public genealogy database that allowed law enforcement access. Distant familial matches emerged, pointing toward a lineage rooted in Weld County. Analysts built family trees slowly, methodically, eliminating branches through records, ages, and locations. One name persisted: Robert Allen Mercer, 46 in 1987, a delivery driver living intermittently in Fort Collins, later relocating to Arizona. He had no violent criminal record, only minor traffic violations. Employment records placed him near Old Town Square on December 10, 1987. A former employer confirmed he used a company vehicle consistent with the tire pattern noted near the culvert. Investigators conducted surveillance, then obtained discarded items for DNA comparison. The profile matched. Mercer was arrested in 2022, extradited to Colorado, and charged with second-degree murder. The evidence presented was cumulative and procedural: the DNA match, the vehicle pattern, the location overlap, and statements from acquaintances recalling his presence in the area that night. The defense challenged the age of the evidence and the reliability of memory. The court admitted the genetic genealogy under existing precedent, emphasizing the chain of custody and consent. The trial concluded in late November, shortly before Thanksgiving. Mercer entered a plea agreement, accepting responsibility in exchange for a determinate sentence. He was sentenced to 30 years. There were no outbursts. The courtroom was quiet. Emily's parents attended, older now, holding hands. In the aftermath, the town acknowledged the resolution without celebration. A short article ran in the local paper, noting the arrest and sentence. The culvert no longer existed, but the road did, carrying winter traffic beneath new lights. Evidence boxes were closed for the last time. The file was marked solved. Christmas came, as it always does, bringing with it a measure of order restored, and the knowledge that patience, procedure, and time had finally aligned. The months following the arrest unfolded with a slower gravity, one that matched the season in which Emily Hollis had vanished decades earlier. Court filings accumulated quietly in the clerk's office, their dates stamped in ink that echoed past winters. The prosecution assembled its narrative without flourish, relying on documentation preserved since 1987 and modern analysis applied with restraint. Each element was presented as part of a timeline rather than a story, emphasizing sequence, proximity, and verification. The defense responded with motions typical of long dormant cases, questioning preservation methods and the interpretation of partial records, but avoiding speculation. For investigators who had inherited the case late in their careers, the work carried a particular weight. Many had grown up in Larimer County and remembered Emily's photograph, taped near registers during Christmas shopping seasons long past. They revisited original police reports, noting the discipline of officers who had logged weather conditions, road maintenance schedules, and traffic patterns. These details, overlooked for years, now reinforced the plausibility of the reconstructed route between Old Town Square, the Strip Mall, and the Culvert location. Snowfall records confirmed the narrow window when tire impressions could have been made and preserved. Witness interviews were revisited with care. Surviving witnesses were elderly, their recollections softened by time, but their original statements were read aloud in depositions to anchor memory. A gas station attendant's note about a delivery truck idling near dusk was corroborated by archived fuel receipts. A store manager's recollection of a man waiting too long by the exit aligned with employment logs showing Mercer's delivery schedule. None of these details stood alone. Together, they formed a lattice of ordinary observations that placed him within Emily's final known movements. The autopsy findings, reviewed again by a forensic pathologist unaffiliated with the original office, were summarized clinically. Exposure following incapacitation remained the conclusion, with no evidence contradicting that assessment. The absence of extensive trauma was presented not as ambiguity, but as consistency with the environment and time frame. The pathologist emphasized limits, explaining what could not be known as clearly as what could. This approach resonated with a jury accustomed to winter realities and the dangers of cold nights. Media attention increased but remained subdued. Local newspapers framed the proceedings as a matter of civic closure rather than spectacle. Headlines avoided Emily's photograph, focusing instead on procedural milestones. Radio reports noted the age of the case and the method by which it had been solved, explaining genetic genealogy in plain terms for an older audience wary of novelty. Letters to the editor reflected cautious approval, emphasizing trust in lawful process. During pretrial hearings, the court addressed the admissibility of the genetic evidence in detail. The judge's rulings cited established precedent and the specific safeguards used, including family consent and independent verification. The decisions were methodical, reading like checklists rather than opinions. Observers noted the absence of drama. The process felt deliberate, almost archival, as if the case itself demanded that pace. Emily's family prepared for the possibility of testimony but were ultimately spared. The plea agreement, reached after weeks of negotiation, removed the need for them to recount loss publicly. In exchange for certainty, the state secured accountability. Mercer's admission was limited, factual, and devoid of narrative. He acknowledged presence, contact, and actions leading to Emily's death without elaboration. The record captured his words and moved on. Sentencing occurred under gray skies in late November. The courthouse steps were slick with frost. Inside, the courtroom was filled but quiet, populated by residents who remembered 1987 and younger officials who knew the case only through files. The sentence reflected statutory guidelines applicable at the time of the offense, adjusted for the plea. 30 years was read into the record, followed by conditions regarding incarceration and parole eligibility. There were no gestures toward forgiveness or remorse recorded. The gavel fell once. Afterward, the administrative work continued. Evidence inventories were updated, noting final disposition. The genetic genealogy process was documented thoroughly for audit and training purposes. Investigators prepared a closing memorandum summarizing lessons learned, emphasizing preservation, patience, and intergenerational continuity in policing. The memo avoided praise, focusing instead on systems. In the community, the impact was subtle. A memorial scholarship in Emily's name, long dormant, received new donations. The local university updated its archives to include the case resolution. The Culvert site, long altered, was mentioned only in footnotes. Life proceeded into December, lights returning to Old Town Square, wreaths hanging again where Emily once worked her shift. For older residents, the resolution carried a quiet reassurance. The idea that careful records and lawful innovation could converge after decades mattered. It suggested that time did not erase responsibility. Thanksgiving passed, then Christmas Eve arrived, marked by colder air and earlier nights. Families gathered with a renewed awareness of absence and endurance. The Hollis family issued a brief statement through the prosecutor's office, thanking those who had not forgotten. It contained no call for attention, only acknowledgement. They returned to private life. Their long wait concluded not with relief but with a settled certainty. The case file, once thick with uncertainty, now rested complete. By New Year's Day, snow covered the county again. Roads were plowed. Courthouse files were shelved. The solved case entered local history, cited occasionally in training sessions and anniversary articles. It stood as an example of restraint and resolve, of a winter crime met with winter patience, and of a community that endured until the record could finally be closed. As the new year settled into its routine, the case of Emily Rae Hollis began to take on a different presence within Larimer County. It was no longer an open wound or an unresolved question, but a completed record, something officials referenced in past tense. For the detectives assigned to close out remaining administrative matters, the work became almost ceremonial. Archived boxes were opened one final time, each item checked against inventories created decades earlier. Property logs from 1987, handwritten in careful block letters, were reconciled with modern digital databases, ensuring that nothing remained undocumented. The investigative timeline, reconstructed for internal review, highlighted how ordinary details had carried extraordinary weight. Snowplow schedules, once dismissed as irrelevant, explained why certain roads showed fewer tracks than expected. Maintenance logs from the county road department confirmed when culverts were inspected, narrowing the window in which Emily's body could have gone unnoticed. These confirmations reinforced the original estimate of time of death, lending further confidence to conclusions reached long before genetic evidence entered the picture. Attention turned briefly to the institutional memory of the case. Retired officers were contacted for voluntary interviews, not to gather new facts, but to record reflections on investigative decisions made in an era before digital mapping and DNA databases. Their recollections were measured, often critical of their own limitations, acknowledging where technology had constrained possibilities. These interviews were preserved as part of departmental history, meant to inform future generations rather than assign blame. The legal resolution also prompted a review of victim support practices. In 1987, resources for families of missing adults had been limited and informal. The Hollis family's experience, documented through correspondence kept in the file, revealed long stretches without updates simply because there were none to give. Modern standards, shaped in part by such cases, now require periodic contact regardless of investigative progress. Emily's case became an example cited in training on communication and transparency. Public reaction continued to be restrained. Local television stations aired brief segments explaining the sentence and the method by which the suspect was identified. These reports emphasized legality and oversight, addressing concerns common among older viewers about privacy and misuse of genetic data. Officials clarified that the process relied on voluntary public databases and judicial authorization, reiterating that the technology was a tool, not a shortcut. In quieter spaces, the case stirred personal memories. Clerks who had once stapled missing person flyers remembered the winter Emily disappeared as particularly cold, though meteorological data showed it was average. Memory, shaped by emotion, had sharpened the season. For them, the resolution brought a sense of alignment between recollection and record, as if the town's memory had finally caught up with documented truth. The courthouse itself bore subtle marks of continuity. Filing cabinets replaced over the years still held labels referencing case numbers that predated digital systems. Emily's file number, now closed, joined others marked solved long after initial investigation. Each represented a thread of persistence woven into the institution's identity. For the Hollis family, daily life resumed without public acknowledgement. Friends noted a shift, not toward joy but toward steadiness. Holidays approached again, Thanksgiving first, then Christmas, mirroring the sequence that framed Emily's disappearance. This time, the dates passed without press inquiries or investigative meetings. The absence remained, but uncertainty did not. Mercer's incarceration followed standard procedure. Intake assessments were completed, medical screenings conducted, and his placement determined according to policy. He became another inmate among many, his crime recorded in institutional databases stripped of narrative. Appeals were waived as part of the plea agreement, closing that avenue definitively. The legal system moved forward, as it is designed to do. In academic circles, the case was discussed briefly at regional law enforcement conferences. Presentations focused on evidence preservation and the ethical framework surrounding genetic genealogy. Emily's name was used sparingly, often replaced by case numbers, reflecting a balance between instruction and respect. The emphasis remained on process rather than outcome. The environment where the crime occurred continued to change. New developments expanded along the outskirts of Fort Collins. Roads were straightened, signage updated, and traffic increased. The service road near the former Culvert became part of a commuter route, its past invisible to those who passed daily. Only maps from the 1980s preserved the original configuration. Local journalists revisited their archives, comparing coverage from 1987 with contemporary reporting. The tone difference was evident. Earlier articles had relied on limited information and cautious language, while modern pieces could explain mechanisms of resolution with clarity. This contrast underscored how advances in forensic science had reshaped not only investigations, but also public understanding. As winter deepened, snowstorms arrived in predictable cycles. County crews worked overnight, clearing roads before dawn. Their logs, still meticulously kept, echoed those that had quietly supported Emily's case decades earlier. Routine documentation, often unnoticed, proved again to be a foundation for accountability. The case's final administrative step involved notification to national databases, updating its status to solved. This action, though procedural, carried symbolic weight. It removed Emily from lists of unresolved cases, narrowing the space of uncertainty maintained by such records. The update was time-stamped and verified, then archived. For those who had followed the case for years, closure did not come as relief, but as confirmation. It affirmed that patience and method could coexist with progress. The resolution did not rewrite the past or soften its impact, but it placed a definitive marker at the end of a long investigative road. As the year turned again, fireworks echoed faintly over the county. Inside homes, older residents watched quietly, reflecting on decades measured by seasons and losses. Emily Hollis's story, once suspended in winter silence, had finally reached its lawful conclusion, leaving behind a record that would endure longer than memory alone. Winter tightened its hold as the fourth decade since Emily Hollis's death quietly closed, and the solved case settled into a quieter phase that rarely draws attention, but defines the endurance of an investigation. Within the sheriff's office, supervisors reviewed how the case had been carried across generations of personnel, noting that continuity did not come from memory but from paper, procedure, and restraint. Emily's file demonstrated how consistent documentation allowed meaning to be recovered long after witnesses faded and landscapes changed. The original responding officers had recorded the discovery scene with an economy of language typical of the era. Measurements were written by hand, compass directions noted, weather conditions logged without flourish. Those pages, once considered routine, became anchors decades later. Their clarity allowed modern analysts to recreate spatial relationships with confidence. It was not brilliance that preserved the case, but discipline. Evidence storage practices were also examined. In the late 1980s, many departments struggled with long-term preservation, yet Emily's case benefited from a clerk who insisted on climate control upgrades during a budget cycle when such requests were often denied. That decision, seemingly administrative, protected trace evidence that later proved decisive. The review committee cited this as an example of how institutional choices ripple forward. The broader legal community observed the case with professional interest. Prosecutors emphasized that no extraordinary measures had been taken, only the application of tools unavailable in 1987 under present-day oversight. Defense attorneys, while critical during pretrial motions, later acknowledged that the evidentiary chain met constitutional standards. The outcome reinforced confidence in the slow but lawful reach of the system. Community memory of Emily Hollis evolved after the resolution. For years, her name had been spoken in conditional terms, always paired with uncertainty. Now it was spoken definitively, attached to a narrative that had an ending. This shift altered how residents discussed the past, allowing remembrance without speculation. Memorial mentions during church announcements and alumni gatherings adopted a quieter tone. The Hollis family declined further interviews. Their choice was respected by local media, which had learned restraint over decades of covering loss in small communities. Editors chose not to revisit the details, focusing instead on institutional lessons. This decision reflected an understanding that repetition does not always equal respect. Within the university archives, Emily's student records were updated with a notation indicating the case resolution. Archivists debated the wording carefully, ensuring accuracy without intrusion. The update served researchers studying campus safety history, situating Emily's experience within a broader context of change rather than isolating it as an anomaly. Mercer's sentence proceeded through the appellate window without incident. The absence of appeals allowed the judgment to stand cleanly, free from the prolonged uncertainty that often follows high-profile convictions. Correctional authorities reported compliance with intake procedures and no irregularities. The system absorbed him, and the case ceased to generate administrative alerts. As another Thanksgiving approached, the seasonal framing of the crime became more apparent to those who had worked it. Investigators reflected privately on how holidays amplify vulnerability and memory. The cold months compress time, drawing past and present closer together. Emily's disappearance during this period had etched itself into the county's collective calendar, returning each year with the same dates. Training academies incorporated the case into curricula focused on cold case management. Recruits studied timelines, not to memorize facts, but to understand packing. They learned how investigators resisted premature conclusions and how evidence was allowed to wait for technology rather than forced into theories. The lesson emphasized patience over pressure. The physical environment continued to erase visible traces. Development replaced open land, and traffic noise filled spaces once quiet. Yet survey maps preserved the former layout, allowing future researchers to visualize conditions as they were. This coexistence of change and record underscored a central truth of the case. Places transform, but documentation holds. Local libraries curated a modest exhibit on resolved cold cases, including Emily's, focusing on process rather than imagery. The exhibit featured copies of redacted reports, timelines, and explanations of forensic evolution. Visitors, many of them older men who remembered the original news, lingered over these displays, reading slowly, absorbing the measured language. For the investigators who closed the case, professional life moved on. New files arrived, new calls came in, and attention shifted. Yet Emily's case remained a reference point, invoked when discussing why evidence should never be discarded simply because it lacks immediate value. It reinforced humility before time. As Christmas lights returned to Old Town Square, the same streets Emily had walked decades earlier filled with shoppers and students. The season carried its familiar mix of warmth and austerity. This time, there were no flyers taped to doors, no unanswered questions hanging in the cold air. The square functioned as it was meant to, a public space without unresolved grief attached. In the end, the resolution did not transform the community or redeem loss. It did something quieter. It confirmed that attention, restraint, and lawful persistence can bridge decades. Emily Hollis's life ended in winter, but her case reached its conclusion through method, not momentum. That distinction mattered to those who had waited, and to those who would carry the work forward long after the season turned again. The closing months of the case passed without ceremony, as most conclusions do when the work has already been done. There were no press conferences, no commemorative plaques, no attempt to elevate the outcome beyond what it was. A lawful resolution reached after patience outlasted time. For those who had carried the file through its final stages, the satisfaction was procedural rather than emotional. The system had functioned as designed, slowly and imperfectly, but ultimately intact. Emily Rae Hollis's name now appeared in county records with a final notation that required no explanation. Solved. The word did not erase what preceded it, but it established a boundary. Investigators no longer referred to her in hypothetical language. Reports stopped using conditional verbs. The past, at last, had a fixed shape. The quiet aftermath revealed how deeply the case had been woven into the fabric of Larimer County. Retired residents spoke of it as a marker of time, a moment they remembered alongside weather patterns, job changes, and children leaving home. For a generation of men now in their 60s and 70s, Emily's disappearance had coincided with a stage of life defined by responsibility and routine. The resolution arrived when routines had slowed, when reflection came more easily. It landed differently because of that. The criminal justice system recorded its final entries. The judgment was logged. The sentence schedule was confirmed. Notifications were sent to state and federal repositories. Each step followed established protocol, the same as any other case, yet the age of the file lent weight to each keystroke. Clerks understood that they were closing a record older than many of the systems they now used. The evidence itself was addressed last. Items no longer required for appeal were reviewed for disposition. Some materials were returned to the family. Others, deemed historically relevant, were retained under archival conditions. The decision balanced respect with responsibility. Nothing was discarded casually. The past was handled deliberately, as it had been throughout. Emily's parents made no public appearance after sentencing. Their absence was noted but not questioned. Those who knew them understood that resolution did not invite celebration. It offered an end to waiting, nothing more. They spent the following Christmas privately, surrounded by family who had grown accustomed to marking holidays with care rather than expectation. In the broader community, the case receded from conversation. That, too, was a sign of closure. Stories that linger unresolved tend to resurface. Stories with endings slowly settle. Emily's name remained known, but no longer restless. It occupied a place in local history rather than current concern. Law enforcement agencies beyond Colorado took notice in understated ways. Training bulletins referenced the case when discussing long-term evidence preservation. Conferences included it in panels about genetic genealogy, always framed within ethical and legal boundaries. The emphasis remained on restraint, reinforcing that technology was an extension of method, not a replacement for it. The courthouse continued its daily rhythm. New filings arrived. Other families waited in hallways. The Hollis case, once a presence felt in winter corridors, became a citation rather than a concern. Its influence persisted quietly, shaping decisions without demanding attention. As seasons turned again, the environment offered familiar contrasts. Snow gave way to spring runoff, then to summer heat that dried creek beds near where the culvert once stood. Each cycle underscored how much had changed since 1987 and how much had not. Roads still connected the same towns. Records still told the truth when handled carefully. The man responsible for Emily's death entered the anonymity of incarceration. His name appeared on rosters, then faded into institutional routine. There were no further revelations, no attempts to reshape the narrative. His admission, limited and factual, stood unchanged. The case required nothing more from him. In the years that followed, Emily's story was occasionally revisited by journalists writing about solved cold cases. Each time, the tone was similar. No sensational language, no speculation, just a recounting of how evidence weighted and how patience mattered. Readers responded quietly, often with brief notes of acknowledgement rather than commentary. The lasting impact of the case rested not in its details but in its discipline. It demonstrated that restraint can be a form of care, that method can survive neglect, and that time, when paired with preservation, does not have to defeat accountability. For an audience shaped by decades of observing institutions rise and fall, that message resonated. On a final administrative level, the case was removed from annual cold case reviews. Its absence from those lists was subtle but meaningful. It reduced the weight carried forward, narrowing the space between unresolved past and manageable present. Every December, Larimer County still enters its quieter stretch. Snow settles, offices dim earlier, people slow their pace. Somewhere within that stillness, Emily Hollis's name rests without uncertainty attached. Her case no longer waits. The resolution did not restore what was lost, and it did not claim to. It provided something more modest and more durable. It affirmed that careful work, preserved records, and lawful persistence can reach across decades. It closed a long chapter without rewriting it. When the final year-end reports were compiled, Emily's case appeared once more briefly as a line item under resolved investigations. Then it disappeared from active documents altogether. That disappearance was the last step. The winter that followed was unremarkable. Roads were cleared, lights were hung, families gathered, and in the quiet continuity of those ordinary acts, the case completed its journey, leaving behind a record that would endure longer than memory alone, steady and complete.